So this is a beautiful little book called Shallow Water Dictionary. Has anybody seen this? This is by John Stilka, who's a historian of cultural landscapes. And I love small, beautiful books. And what this is, it's a dictionary, a collection of words about the space between water and land, between fresh water and salt water, particularly in the New England context. And so there are words like rill and rack, skiff, skeg, scow, staddle, bore, guzzle, these really delicious words that mean very specific things in the context of the New England shoreline. And when we start to really examine those words and think about them and what they represent about space and place, I think we gain an understanding of the place and the language we use about it. So each week I'm going to ask us to think about the word. And today the natural word perhaps to think about would be map, because Darin's going to talk to us about maps. And we could have many conversations about, as Darin and I have had, about what is a map and what is not a map. But the reason that I'm talking about plan instead is because plan allows us to talk a little bit more about time. Now the word for map comes from the same word as napkin, so it originally meant something on cloth. So it's something physical. And so one thing Darin and I have debated is, well, you know, this is a map. It's something that somebody has drawn. When you get into something interactive like this that has so many different meanings and so many different experiences depending on where you click, is this a map? So this is a map you can get. It's a lot of depth of information about public art in San Francisco. And Darin argued, no, this is not a map, this is a database. Interesting question. But back to maps and plans. Planning has a temporal aspect. We usually think of a plan as something in the future. You plan for retirement, you plan for vacation, you plan to end homelessness. But originally it was not about time, it was about perspective, not a perspective looking forward in time, but a perspective of looking directly down on something. So in architecture and planning, these two are not plans. This is a plan because you're looking straight down on it. This is an elevation because you're looking at something from the front. This is a section because it's cutting through and showing you the walls that you have cut through. So the word plan originally referred to the ground plane. It's related to the word plant, you know, planting in the ground, and it's also obviously about flatness and planes. So this is a plan. In the case of a house, none of these gives you a real experience of the house. Both the plans, the elevation, and the section are inadequate. Even more so looking at a plan of the city, which flattens the city into two dimensions. This is an idea of Chicago. It's not obviously the experience. In a cathedral, sometimes a section gives you a much better sense of the experience of being in the building than the plan. Depends on what you're trying to understand. When you combine a section, a perspective drawing, and representing three dimensions on a flat piece of paper, you start to get a little bit closer, but it's still inadequate. In the case of looking at cities, urban designers, that is the folks who are focused not on buildings as individual objects, but in the spaces between them and the design of neighborhoods and cities. Urban designers tend to look a lot at sections, that is, a slice through the city, section meaning not a portion of the city, but a slice, a cut. The idea is that this gives you some idea of the experience of walking through the city because you're looking at a house, a street, a house, a backyard, a tall building, a sidewalk, a street, a sidewalk, a building, a backyard, a building, house, street. And this gives a different view than a plan view looking straight down on things, but it's still inadequate. The other thing that the word plan, the way that the word plan is complicated is that it can compress time. So this is a typical representation of a master plan for a city. And what's interesting and what's typical about it is that It represents the past and existing conditions and a proposal for the future, all in one image. And they're smushed together in a way that is not entirely honest in a way. And this was one of the winners in our map competition last year, and you can see all of the entries at a website called seethroughmaps.wordpress.com. And we selected this because of the essay that the planner who made this map or plan wrote about this. And this is Berezniki, which is a city in Russia, and it has lots of sinkholes because of the mining that has occurred there over the years. And the purpose of this image was to win the contract. So the planning firm wanted to persuade the authorities there that they had the best plan for the future. And what the planner who made this this map or this image reflected upon, he basically revealed the tools of the trade. And here's what he said. Basically, this light gray is the proposal for the future, as is this part over here. And here are the tricks he used. He said first he colorized the background, so the surrounding areas, to look the way that the people there imagined themselves. So it was green and forested and what that part of Russia was supposed to be like. Then he harmonized that, so the proposal for the new areas made it as harmonious as possible to make it seem inevitable. He added these fake clouds to make it seem like reality, like a snapshot, an aerial photo. When in reality, this is a mashup of the past, the existing conditions, and the proposal for the future, which is not at all inevitable or natural, but which the maker of this image wanted to argue is natural and inevitable. Please choose our firm. This is the way the future should look, and this is the way the future will look, looking backwards in time once it's done. So I think it's interesting. If you take a look at the City Maps site and read his essay, it's quite interesting. So this is one example of how a plan compresses the world into two dimensions and also compresses the past, the present, and the future into a sandwich that sometimes we need to pick apart. So that's just some thoughts on the word plan for you to think about as you listen to Darin talk about maps, which are generally plan views of cities, and his attempts with his students to add more than two dimensions and fuller representation of the experience of cities in this project. So Darin Jensen, we are very pleased to have here, is the staff geographer for the Department of Geography. He also teaches both cartography and geographic information systems. He was a juror last year and very helpful to us on our map competition and exhibit. He's been a consultant on a lot of interesting projects, including the New Deal, what is the name of the Living New Deal project. And he's going to talk today about the mission and about Oakland. So, welcome.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to turn the lights off, and I hope that I will have enough ambient light from this to maybe see my notes. Thank you for having me. This is great. An excuse to put on better shoes than I normally wear. As Susan said, I'm going to correct you just a little bit. You said staff geographer. I'm the staff cartographer, which means that I provide cartographic services to primarily our faculty and consulting to our grad students and any students and anybody on the campus that comes along. Time permitting, I'm happy to meet with people and talk about cartography. I'm also a continuing lecturer. These are two discrete half-time positions, and they make for one wonderful career for me. The staff part of my job gives me the creative freedom to pursue projects that I find interesting, and my students give me a fantastic repository of labor, basically. And at the same time that they're training to be cartographers, and students often coming out of my class win entry-level positions at all kinds of different cartography and GIS firms, as well as public utilities, and doing things like retail cartography for large retail businesses. So this is a really exciting subject for me. Sensing places, reading places is exactly what cartography is all about. Mapping is inherently a sensing practice. We use collected data, satellite imagery, ground truthing, and source maps, existing maps, to sense place. Reading place, to me, becomes a bit more subjective. To read a place is interpretive, right? And so that requires experience. So with the Mission Possible project, which by the way is a collaboration with Mission Local, which is a hyper-local news outlet in the Mission that is run under the auspices of the journalism school and Professor Lydia Chavez, currently hopefully being spun off as its own entity right now. With Mission Possible, we employed experiential learning combined with the traditional cartographic sensing techniques to create a, I'll say, hoped-for holistic picture of place, or a narrative of place. The map itself is a superb narrative device. It's a storytelling format, and I say this even as I'm working on an MFA in creative writing. I like telling stories, I like writing stories, but there's nothing like making a map for being able to distill sometimes and often complicated story onto one page, and you just are not able to do that with text. Maps also speak to a very wide audience. They often will transcend culture and education attainment, and can also sometimes transcend language. And that's a wonderful thing. You have a much broader audience. Unlike text, which always starts with the first paragraph and the first sentence, we're always forced into that first word. This is where the story begins. A map allows the reader to enter the narrative anywhere they choose, and that might be the title. They might be drawn to the data, to the base map, getting an orientation of the place, but it allows a freedom of movement in the storytelling, and therefore it might worry some that the story is different for everybody. But I would argue that essentially a well-designed map is going to impart the whole story, even if it is in a different order than you might find if you tried to tell that story with text. And also, as I mentioned, distills it onto one page. Any one of these map stories, I'll maybe refer to them as, would take pages and pages, maybe scores of pages to describe in text. So if maps can tell a story, or an atlas or a collection of maps, I think can tell a story even better. And Dennis Wood, and I hope you, if you haven't, will take the time to read Everything Sings, which is his opening essay in a book by the same name, which is a book about maps for a narrative atlas. It's interesting, he makes it clear that it is not the narrative atlas, but it's some of the maps that could become a narrative atlas, and really the book is a rumination on the concept of a narrative atlas. And I got a little bit ahead of myself, I'm sorry, with the slides. Here's the collection of maps, and so in their order, they tell a story, they have a narrative. And Dennis Wood argues that the compiler of an atlas arranges maps in a certain way to guide that narrative. You have the discrete narrative on the map page, you combine them together, and then you are forming a thread narrative for the atlas. And this idea is exactly why this publication is bound with notepad glue. It tears apart. In fact, any amount of handling in it does come apart. And it's delivered in an envelope so that the next time, so when it's put away, and the next time you pull it out, there's a slightly different narrative about this place. And I think that's a really important thing, and it's a cumbersome thing to do. Easy with 20-some maps. You have a book of 50 or more, it would be a difficult thing to just mechanically deal with. But for this fun little project, it worked really well. So as a project of experiential learning, and also because it is such a large-scale mapping, we were very careful to be mindful of the people who would be mapped. We expressed our consideration by our orientation. So this is the title page and the locator map for the atlas. And you'll notice that it's oriented west. And this is partly because we were students working in a studio in Berkeley, and our view of the mission is to the west. But it also is something that I actually rail on quite a bit, that the conventional northern orientation of a map is a construct that is really based in northern hemisphere centrism. And when you're, because of course there's no upright position of our planet in space. We're a sphere hurtling through space, and north is not up. Elevation is up. Levitation is up. So north at the top of the map is not something I'm very fond of, and I try to buck that whenever I can. But also, and most importantly, by orienting these maps west, for a neighborhood, as I say in the introduction to this volume, is living a history of a relationship between the north and the south, then we can put the north and the south on a horizontal plane, leveling them, not making the north superior or above the south. So that was really important for us. We also acknowledge that by virtue of experiential sensing, we became part of the milieu. Our interest would drive the choice of subject matter. In most cases, there are at the end some just straight up population change maps. But even then, a person's personal aesthetic, to choose colors, adds something to the story. So the cartographer in a project like this, where they're on the ground, they're mapping something that is of interest to them in a place that they do not necessarily call home, puts them in the milieu, and it actually creates a personal kind of skin on the maps. So this is Darin Jensen, and I'm going to try really hard to always remember to name the cartographer. One of the things that's been slightly embarrassing for me is that when this project got the press it did, I was always credited with making these maps, and I didn't make any of these maps. I spent a lot of time with students working on them and editing them, but they pretty much are all of their own design and chosen subject matter. So Darin Jensen made this map, Mission Saturday Sounds, and he spent one Saturday in the Mission with an analog sound meter. He was very proud to tell me it was analog, and he even said, I took my notes with lead, not a pen. I thought that was really cool. So he stood on these corners, and the blue circles denote the lowest decibel reading, and the pink circles denote the highest decibel reading. And this was all in one day, of course, spread throughout the day. And then he was taking notes, and we included some of the notes there, like the tow truck up by Dolores Park, which of course is a fleeting thing, right? So that is not how loud that corner is all day long on a Saturday or any day. It was, this is a moment of Darin's experience. So this is definitely an example of Darin being in the Mission and his experience there. June Thammasnon made this map, Mission Sustainable, and this map is all about how one can be a consumer in the Mission, but but only buy used products, as long as they're products that fall into these categories, which are used clothing, books, music, that sort of thing. And I love this map because of the aesthetic. It would be completely overwhelming for more than one map, but I thought it was really great. That's another thing that I will just mention in passing about the design, was that when I work on these projects, I think it's really important to always honor the cartographer's own aesthetic, and what we did to, I'm going to go back a couple slides, what we did to kind of unify them is we just had the same width border on all pages. This is a full bleed atlas, so they were all cut to full bleed, and so there's this unifying design element there, as well as the the treatment of the scale and the source information. So this is something that's important to June, living sustainably, and her expression of it as it manifests in the Mission District. Chris Fuentes made this map, and this student is a triathlete. So again, bringing his experience to mapping something in the Mission that becomes a resource for people in the Mission or visiting the Mission. So he designed these runs, over here suggested runs, easy, medium, and hard. There's a couple of profiles there of two of the steepest hills, so you can see your elevation gain. As a runner, I'm interested in that sort of thing. And other facilities like gyms and the cross-training things like Mission Cliffs, swimming pools, and bike lanes. And then his favorite post-workout snacks, which are usually yogurt, frozen yogurt. So it's rich data. It's hard to see on the screen, but there's hypsography, the elevation contours in the background. It definitely adds to the picture of this place. And this, among a few of the other maps, definitely is not what people think of when they think of the Mission. But when you see these maps together, you start to see that there are lots of ways to see the Mission. This is one of my favorite maps, and it gives me an opportunity to comment on the word plan, which is great. Maps are always, it seems, a view downward, as Susan described. This map is actually a view up. If you were laying on the sidewalk, which is why west is at the bottom, because you're laying down holding it like this, and then suddenly it's oriented west again. This is Heather Sparks, and this is a map of everything that's really above the street grid. The green dots are the San Francisco tree census. Most cities keep a tree census, a database, a very rich database of every tree with its name, age, height, and so the color, the darker the color, the taller the tree. The orange lines are electric community lines, the purple polygons are billboards, the yellow sunbursts are solar panels, the blue concentric circles are cell towers, the snaky purpley brown thing over there is the elevated freeway. I'm wondering what the red dots are right now, because I don't see, traffic signals that dangle over intersections. So this is all information that you don't necessarily get when you look at a plan of a place. I really like this map. Another thing I like about it is we gave ourselves the freedom to express ephemeral concepts as well. So there's this gray swooping lines throughout. There's lots of birds overhead in the Mission, but you can't, of course, track everywhere a bird goes. And so she implied this with choosing some bird routes. Okay, and so then those were three maps that very much steeped in the personal experience of the cartographer in the Mission. And then there are some, let's see, I'm sorry. And I was considering Heather's map a non-human map subject that is also adding to the story of life in the Mission. And now we'll move on to something that became quite controversial. There's another map in the atlas that is called Gangs and Cupcakes, and that got around the web a lot, was featured on Huffington Post.